Welcome to this episode of Guys, Guns, and Gears. Alright, we're going to do a quick tutorial on setting wheel bearings. Today we're working on a Dana 60 front axle, assembling this axle here, setting the bearing preload, or end play in this case. Just wanted to give a quick tutorial. I know this is an area where a lot of people struggle. I've gotten this question quite a number of times. How do I set the wheel bearing? What's too tight? What's too loose? So in this particular case, what we're after here is we want a couple thousandths at the most of play. Now, sure, if you have a feeler gauge, great. You could do it that way. That works. But I don't think I've ever once actually used a feeler gauge in an application like this. What we're after is just to feel a very small amount of movement between the spindle and the hub. How you do that is you grab onto your rotor. This is very easy to do as well if you have the tire on, because it does give you more leverage to grab, wiggle. For the sake of the video, you wouldn't see certainly a thousandths of movement. Pretty much impossible to display that here on the video, and I don't feel like setting up a feeler gauge to do so. But this particular type of axle uses two of these nuts and one lock washer in between. So I've already got one nut on. I've taken my wrench here, tightened that bearing down over tight, reefing on it a little bit, leaning into it slightly. No need to get a big cheater bar and a pipe on the end. You can actually damage your bearing. All we're trying to do is seat our bearing. Then spin the rotor or the hub several times in each direction, back and forth, back and forth. That'll seat it. Give it another snug, back and forth. Do this a couple times until you feel the bearings are all the way seated. Then we take our ratchet and our socket, back that nut off. We're going to take all the preload right off. At that point, now we're setting it with our hand. So that's all we need to do is use our hand on the socket, or in the case where you can actually get to the nut, you can just by hand turn that nut back and forth. Grab the rotor, wiggle it back and forth until you feel just a thousandths or two. That is just a small amount of movement, basically just to the point where you can actually feel the movement. Now the tricky part here is when we're dealing with this sort of axle where you've got a second nut and this washer that goes in between, this lock washer. So in this case, we would set our bearing tension or preload, end play, by backing it off, put on this washer, put our second nut on, tighten that nut down. Now what that does is actually take the first nut that's already installed and push it to the other side of the threads. This second nut changes the load on that first nut from pulling back on the threads as it is now to pushing forward on the threads. Just a word to the wise, that eats up a thousandths or two of end play. Sometimes more, sometimes less, depends on the threads, how worn they are, how fine they are, and so on. So in an application like this, when you're setting it with a dual nut system, go extra loose on your first nut, put your washer on, put your second nut on, torque that down well. You can lean into it a little bit. Then feel your end play. If it's too loose or you can't feel any end play, take this nut all the way off, take this lock washer off, back out your first nut, the inside one, and start over. If it's too tight, back it out. If it's too loose, go in. This isn't an exact science, but you do want it right if you want it to last a good long time. If you follow this method, you can get many, many, many miles out of a set of bearings. A couple other notes here as well. Don't ever skimp on the bearings. Go high quality, name brand bearings. OE equivalent or better. Timken, can't go wrong. Moog, in a number of different bearing applications. National Bearing. Just stick with a name brand. I do not shop at AutoZone or the like unless I absolutely have to. Their bearings, they have some name brand, just a word to the wise. Stick with a good bearing, especially a unit bearing where it's all in here as one unit and it slides on as part of the hub. I've seen cheap bearings on small cars go bad in a matter of just a couple of months because you skimped on the bearing. Sure, there's a lifetime warranty, but it does not warranty your labor in most applications, and it doesn't cover your busted knuckles from fighting those bearings on and off, having to replace them. The other note is use a good grease. High quality grease, can't speak highly enough on it. My background is agricultural, where a lot of times bearings are rolling in the dirt, in the mud, often in the manure, and a high quality bearing can exponentially increase bearing life. So in this case, I'm using a Mobil grease. It's a good grease all around. Different applications, there's pros and cons to different greases, but just a good general purpose grease in an application like this, setting your bearings up properly, you'll get many miles out of a properly set up bearing. Too tight, too loose, exponentially decrease the life of your bearing. So play around with it a little bit, take your time, don't rush through it. I've heard quite a few people say, okay, tighten it, set your bearing, back it off, go until it just touches. Okay, yep, as a rule of thumb, that often works. Often that is a pretty good starting point, but I wouldn't assemble it and call it good from there, especially not when you're dealing with a dual nut system like this, because you add that second nut, as I stated earlier, it's actually going to push that first nut to the back of the threads, adding more preload to the bearing or taking out your end play. So there you go. Hopefully this helps. Hopefully that made sense. Comment below, like, subscribe, all that jazz. Not really sure what good it does. I'm just a guy shooting videos in my garage, trying to pass along some of the knowledge. When I started doing this stuff, this technology didn't exist. What an amazing time here to be able to look this stuff up on YouTube. I do it on a regular basis. Run into a situation I've never seen before, whether it's working on a washing machine, you name it. So anyway, I've rambled on long enough.